The morning Garrison Holt decided to make an example of Sena Addae, he did it with a microphone in his hand and an audience of 400 employees watching from stadium seating in the glass atrium of Parity Systems' Toronto headquarters. He had called the all-hands meeting for 10 o'clock on a Tuesday, the kind of morning in late October when the sky over Lake Ontario sits low and gray and the city feels like it is holding its breath. The employees filed in from every floor, coffee cups in hand, laptops tucked under arms, settling into rows that curved up toward the high windows. Garrison stood at the center of it all in a fitted charcoal blazer. No tie. The way he always dressed when he wanted to project both authority and approachability in equal measure. A calculation he had learned at business school and never questioned. He had prepared remarks. He had a slide deck. He had a rehearsed cadence of pauses designed to land each announcement with maximum impact. What he had not prepared for, though he would think about it later in the particular silence of a late-night office when no one else remained on the floor, was the way Sena Addae looked at him from across the room when he said, "Seen the word." He announced that the board had decided to transition strategic advisory responsibilities to a team of 6 consultants from a firm called Meridian Partners out of San Francisco. He said the company was entering a phase of aggressive scaling that required execution-focused leadership rather than foundational thinking. He used phrases like world-class talent and proven track record at the highest levels of the industry. At the highest levels, he gestured towards 6 consultants sitting in the front row, each of them in matching lanyards, each of them with a biography that included Stanford or MIT or Carnegie Mellon and at least one successful IPO somewhere in their recent past. He did not say Sena Addae's name. He did not have to. Everyone in that atrium understood exactly whose 10 years of strategic guidance had just been reclassified as foundational thinking, as something the company had outgrown. Sena was seated near the back of the room, not out of modesty, but because she had arrived exactly on time, and every other seat was already filled. She was 47 years old, wearing a dark green pullover and the kind of plain dark trousers that suggested she had stopped thinking about what she wore to meetings a long time ago. She had her notebook open on her knee, the same kind of spiral-bound notebook she had used for 30 years, and she was writing something in it when Garrison began to speak. She stopped writing when she heard the tone of what was coming, and she set the pen down carefully at the top of the page. She did not interrupt. She did not raise her hand. She listened until he was finished, and then she sat still for a moment the way a person sits still when they are deciding something rather than reacting to something. Then she stood, gathered her notebook and her jacket from the back of the chair, and walked toward the exit at the side of the atrium without making eye contact with anyone. Several of the younger employees near the door stepped back slightly as she passed, the way people step back from something they cannot quite name. At the door, she paused and turned back. Not to address the room, not to make a speech, but because a junior engineer named Tomas, who had joined the company 8 months earlier from a program at Ryerson University, was standing close enough that she could speak to him quietly. She told him to watch the latency logs on the training cluster every morning before 9, because there was a drift pattern building in the primary model that the automated monitoring system was not calibrated to catch yet. She told him he would know it when he saw it. Then she thanked him for the conversations they had shared in the corridor outside the server room, and she walked out through the glass door and into the gray October morning. Nobody laughed. Nobody applauded. The room held a kind of charged silence that Garrison tried to break by pivoting back to his slide deck. But the momentum had gone out of the room in a way that no amount of projected charts could quite restore. Sena Addae had not been born into the kind of family that sent children to university with a plan already written out. She had grown up in Scarborough, in a rented townhouse 3 blocks from the 401, in a household where her mother worked double shifts at a care facility and her father repaired appliances out of their garage on weekends to cover what the shifts didn't. There had been no family name in technology, No inherited network, no mentor who had arrived with a business card and a connection to make. There had been a library card, a second-hand computer her father had salvaged from a client's discard pile, and a stubbornness that everyone in her family recognized and nobody ever quite knew what to do with. She had taught herself to code at 14, not because anyone told her it was a path to something, but because the machine interested her in the way that genuinely interesting things interest a person before they learn what they are supposed to be interested in. By the time she was in her early 20s, working days at a small data processing company, and spending her evenings building what she thought of as a cleaner way to handle large-scale distributed inference, she had already developed something that the industry would later call a breakthrough. She had not called it anything. She had called it Tuesday, which was the night of the week. She finished the first working version. A manager at that company, a man a decade older than her with a facility for meetings and very little facility for code, had taken the architecture she built over 18 months of her own time, formatted it into a presentation with his name at the top, and delivered it to a potential partner as his own work. She found out 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, from a colleague who assumed she already knew. The manager received a promotion and a substantial retention bonus. Sena received nothing because she had documented everything in her own notebooks rather than in the company system. And when she raised the issue quietly, the notebooks were simply her word against his, and his word was attached to a salary twice the size of hers. She did not file a complaint. She did not make a scene. She went home that evening, sat at the kitchen table in her small apartment, and made a decision that she would build something of her own that no one could take credit for, because she would be the only person who had built it. 7 years later, she had done exactly that. The company she co-founded in her Scarborough living room, working alongside 3 other people who shared the same stubbornness, became the foundational infrastructure layer for a significant portion of Canada's AI development ecosystem. When she sold her stake at 41, she was worth more than most people in any room she entered, though she rarely gave anyone in a single person. Though she rarely gave anyone reason to guess it from looking at her. She had agreed to advise parity systems not for money, which she did not need, and not for credit, which she had long since stopped chasing, but because she recognized in their early technical architecture something she had once built herself in a different context, and she could see exactly where it would break if no one paid attention. She had paid attention for 10 years. She had written memos that saved 2 product cycles and redirected the company away from an infrastructure decision that would have cost them 3 years and their best engineers. None of it appeared in any press release under her name. And now Garrison Holt, who had arrived with his MBA and his network and his very clear sense of what successful technology leadership looked like, had decided she was foundational thinking. The 6 consultants from Meridian Partners arrived with tremendous energy. They conducted 3 days of comprehensive discovery sessions, filled whiteboards with frameworks, and produced a 60-page technical audit that concluded the company's AI model was essentially sound and required only a program of targeted optimizations to reach the performance thresholds required by their flagship contract. The flagship contract was with the federal government, a pilot program for an AI-assisted case management system that Ottawa had been developing for 2 years and had committed to demonstrating live to a parliamentary committee in less than 8 weeks. The contract was worth $400 million over 5 years, and Parity Systems had spent 14 months winning it. The consultants began their optimization work the following Monday. They were thorough. They were methodical. They ran benchmarks, adjusted hyperparameters, and refactored sections of the codebase that they identified as inefficient. By the end of the 3rd week, the model's performance metrics had improved by a measurable margin on every standard benchmark they tested. The problem surfaced on a Wednesday morning in early November, when the latency logs showed something the automated monitoring had not flagged. A slow and consistent drift in the model's primary inference pathway that was not visible in the standard benchmarks because it only appeared under the specific load conditions that the government system would generate during live use. The drift was not catastrophic. It was subtle, but under the conditions of a live demonstration in front of a parliamentary committee with government officials watching a system make real-time decisions about real case files, subtle would be more than enough to collapse everything. Tomas found it at 8:47 in the morning, which was earlier than 9, but only because he had come in early that day without being entirely sure why. He had been watching the logs every morning since October, the way Sena had told him to. He printed the readings and walked 3 floors up to the office of the lead Meridian consultant, a man with patents to his name and a manner that suggested he had not been wrong about a technical problem in some time. The consultant studied the printout. He ran his own analysis. He agreed there was an anomaly and said with complete confidence that it was a data pipeline synchronization issue he had seen before in systems of this type, and that his team would resolve it within 48 hours. 48 hours later, the drift was still there. It had actually worsened slightly, which the consultant's team attributed to the adjustments they had made during the attempted fix. They pivoted to a different hypothesis. The model's embedding layer was generating instability under load, a known issue in certain training architectures, and the solution was to retrain a portion of the model with an expanded dataset and adjusted regularization parameters. This would take 10 days. 10 days later, the drift remained. By the 5th week, the Meridian team had proposed and tested 7 separate interventions, each one informed by a different hypothesis about the root cause of the problem, and each one producing results that looked promising in some isolation and collapsed under real-world load conditions. The government demonstration was now 3 weeks away. The parliamentary committee had confirmed attendance. The deputy minister's office had issued a briefing note to the minister. There was no quiet way out of what was coming. Garrison had stopped attending the daily technical briefings by the 4th week because standing in a room while people described failure with increasingly technical vocabulary had stopped providing him with any useful information. He had been receiving calls from the board chair every 3 days, and the calls had grown shorter as the content of them had grown more direct. On a Sunday evening in late November, he received a call from the lead investor in the company's Series C round, a man who had backed 3 successful companies before this one and who spoke with the particular economy of language that came from having run out of patience some time ago. The investor asked him simply whether the government contract was still viable. Garrison said yes. The investor said he hoped that was true and ended the call. Garrison sat in his office afterward, with his phone face down on the desk and the city lights spread out below the window, and he understood for the first time what his optimism had been preventing him from understanding for weeks. The problem in front of him was not a technical problem his consultants had simply not identified yet. It was a problem that 6 of the most credentialed engineers money could assemble had already addressed in 7 different configurations and been wrong about each time. And he did not know what to do with that. The following morning, he walked down to the server room level, which he had visited exactly twice since joining the company. He stood in the corridor outside, watching through the small window in the door, as Tomas sat at his desk with 3 monitors running and a spiral-bound notebook open beside his keyboard. Garrison recognized the notebook. He had seen one exactly like it, filled with the same small, precise handwriting, many times in the boardroom over the past 10 years. He asked for Tomas, and when the young engineer came into the corridor, Garrison asked him directly whether he knew why the model kept drifting. Tomas said he had some ideas. He said he had been going through the original architecture documentation from the early design phase, and that he kept finding the same name at the bottom of the core design decisions. Written, not on the official documents, but on the handwritten annotation pages that had been scanned into the archive when the company digitized its early records. The name appeared on 47 separate annotation pages spanning the first 5 years of the model's development. It was not an engineer who still worked at the company. It was not a name that appeared anywhere in the company's public technical documentation. It was Sena Addae every time, in the same small handwriting Tomas recognized from the notebook she had carried into every meeting he had ever seen her attend. He had pulled the archive footage as well, out of curiosity rather than any specific plan, and what he found was a record of someone who had spent a decade arriving early and staying late, sitting beside the original lead engineers during critical design sessions, not as a formal decision maker, but as the person everyone in the room kept directing their most difficult questions toward, whose answers always ended a discussion rather than extending it. Garrison drove to the address himself, without his assistant and without preparation, because he did not know what he would say in advance, and felt that arriving with prepared remarks would make the conversation worse rather than better. The address was a community center in Scarborough, a low brick building on a side street near a shopping plaza, the kind of building that has been painted over several times and still looks like what it is. A place held together by the people who use it rather than the money spent on it. He found her inside, in a large room with folding tables arranged in rows, working with a group of teenagers. Each teenager had a laptop open and a question in some stage of being asked. Sena was sitting beside a girl of about 16 who was looking at her screen with the concentrated frown of someone who can see that something is wrong but cannot yet see what. Sena was not looking at the screen. She was listening to the girl describe the problem. Her hands folded on the table, her attention entirely on the person speaking rather than the code being described. She saw Garrison come in. She did not look surprised. She finished what she was doing with the student, made a note in the girl's notebook for her to reference later, and then walked to where Garrison was standing near the door. He told her the model was failing. He told her the government demonstration was 3 weeks away and that 6 consultants with more combined credentials than he could easily count had not found the root cause in 5 weeks of trying. He told her the contract was at serious risk. He said it plainly, the way a person speaks when they have stopped caring how they sound. Sena looked at him for a moment and then told him no. He had expected some version of anger, or negotiation, or at least a performance of reluctance before eventual agreement. He had not expected the simple, quiet finality of no. He asked her why she would not come back when the stakes were this high for so many people at the company. She looked over her shoulder at the room of teenagers behind her, then back at him, and she told him a story he had not known about her, that he had never thought to look for because it had not appeared in any professional biography he had ever read. She told him about the man who had taken her architecture 23 years ago and presented it as his own to a room full of people who had no reason to question him. She told him about arriving at the office the morning after she found out, making coffee in the break room, and deciding not to say anything in a room full of people. Not because she was afraid, because she had already learned by then that rooms full of people were rarely where justice was decided, and she had work to do that mattered more than making someone uncomfortable. She told him she had stayed at that company for another 8 months, because the work itself was not the man's fault and it still needed doing, and she had done it. And then she left and built something that no one could put their name on without her permission. She told him she had come to Parity Systems because she had seen the architecture and recognized what it could become. And she had given 10 years of her most careful thinking to making it what it needed to be. She had given it without asking for a press release, or a title, or a percentage she did not need. And he had stood at a microphone in front of 400 people and told them that what she had given was foundational thinking, which was something you thanked and then moved past. She was not angry when she said it. She was the same person she had been in the atrium on that October Tuesday, present and clear and entirely uninterested in performing a feeling she did not have. Garrison stood in the doorway of the community center with the sounds of teenagers coating behind him and the November wind coming in off the street, and he understood that he had not simply made a poor strategic decision. He had looked at a person and decided what she was worth, without reading a single page she had actually written. He had confused the paper on the wall with the knowledge behind the wall, and the distance between the two had just cost him 5 weeks, and very possibly everything the company had built toward. He asked her what it would take for her to come back. She thought for a moment, in the same way she had thought in the atrium before walking out, a stillness that was deciding rather than performing. Then she told him, not a raise, not a title. She wanted a program built into the company's structure and budgeted properly that brought young people from communities like this one into parity systems every year for real technical work, not internships that ended with gift cards and LinkedIn endorsements. She wanted a path that did not begin at a university gate. She wanted it committed to in writing by the board, not as a corporate social responsibility line item, but as a hiring and development strategy with genuine teeth. That was the condition, not for her. For the girl at the folding table, with the frown and the bug, and the particular quality of attention she brought to a problem she could not yet solve, that girl was going to need somewhere real to take that ability when she was ready. Garrison agreed before she had finished speaking. When Sena walked back into the Parity Systems server room the following morning, the entire technical floor seemed to slow. Word had spread the way it spreads in any place where people are paying attention, which is to say faster than any official communication. The Meridian consultants were present. 5 weeks of printouts and test results, arranged around them in layers, and they watched her enter with the complicated expression of people who are simultaneously relieved and unsettled. She circled the primary system terminals without touching anything, reading the screens in sequence. The same way she had once walked a room of servers on a different occasion when a different system had gone quiet, and no one in the building could explain why. She asked Tomas to pull up the latency logs from the first week the drift appeared. She looked at them for a long time, her notebook open on the table beside her, making notations she did not explain to anyone watching. Then she told the room, in a voice that carried without being raised, that they had been treating the drift as an output problem when it was an input problem. The model was not generating instability during inference. It was receiving it through a pre-processing pathway that had been written to handle one class of document structure and was being asked to handle 3 distinct classes without anyone having adjusted the normalization parameters to account for the difference. Every optimization they had applied downstream was 2 steps earlier in the pipeline. The root cause was 2 steps earlier in the pipeline than any of the 7 interventions had reached. She sat down at a terminal, opened the configuration files, and made 4 specific adjustments to the pre-processing normalization parameters. She did not rewrite the model. She did not retrain anything. She adjusted 4 numbers in 4 places with the certainty of someone who had written the original logic and remembered exactly what she had intended it to do. She told Tomas to run the test under full government load simulation. The room went silent. The lead Meridian consultant, who had been standing with his arms folded, unfolded them and leaned forward slightly. The test ran for 4 minutes. The latency logs held flat. No drift. 3 more passes. The same result each time, flat and stable, and exactly what the government system required. Someone near the equipment rack let out a breath that sounded almost involuntary. One of the younger engineers sat down heavily in her chair, not from distress, but from the particular weight of attention releasing all at once. The lead consultant looked at his own printouts, then at the screen, then back at his printouts, and said nothing, because there was nothing that would have improved what he was thinking. Garrison called a company-wide meeting for the following morning. He stood on the same platform in the same atrium, but he had no slide deck and no rehearsed pauses. He told the room that he had made his judgment based on what credentials looked like on paper, and not on what contribution looked like in practice. He said that the most essential knowledge in that building had been accumulated over 30 years of showing up to hard problems and refusing to be wrong about them any more times than necessary, and that he had described that knowledge as something the company had grown past. He said that description had been wrong, and that it had very nearly cost them everything they had spent years building together. He did not qualify the statement. He did not attach a pivot, or a lesson framework, or a 5-point plan to it. He said it, and then stepped back from the microphone. The employees who had been with the company since its earliest days, people who remembered when the server room was a rented space above a restaurant on King Street, and the board meetings happened at a folding table, looked at each other with expressions that said they had not expected to hear that, and that hearing it had changed something they had not been sure could change. The Meridian consultants, rather than growing defensive or resentful, spent the following days asking Tomas if Sena would be willing to walk them through the original architecture logic, an offer she accepted without ceremony, and which produced 3 days of the most productive technical conversation the building had seen in months. Sena accepted the title of chief architect, which the board offered, and which she agreed to hold, because it came with the authority to run the program she had made her condition, and that program was the point. She did not move into an executive office. She kept her desk in the technical area, near the server room, in the same open plan section where Tomas worked and where the hum of the cooling systems ran underneath every conversation like a low and steady fact. The government demonstration went without incident. The system performed exactly as specified under live conditions, in front of the parliamentary committee, with no drift and no delay. The officials in the room saw a clean demonstration of a capable system. They did not see the 5 weeks that had preceded it, or the October morning that had preceded that, or the 30 years of paying attention that had preceded everything. After the delegation left and the building had mostly emptied for the evening, Tomas found Sena in the server room, doing what she often did at the end of a long day, which was nothing in particular. She was sitting at a workstation with the cooling system humming around her and the logs running quietly on the screen, and she was writing in her notebook. He sat down across from her and asked what she was writing. She told him she was documenting what she had observed about the preprocessing drift, the specific conditions that had allowed it to develop, and the conditions under which it would be most likely to surface again. She was writing it in the notebook, rather than directly into the system documentation, because notebooks were where she thought. And thinking it through properly was more important than filing it quickly. He asked her why she had come back after everything. She closed the notebook and set it on the desk and looked at the screen for a moment before she answered. She told Wolf that the system was not finished, that there was still work in it that needed someone who understood where it had started and where it was trying to go, and that the girl in Scarborough, with the frown and the bug and the particular quality of attention she brought to a problem she could not yet solve, that girl was going to need somewhere worth going when she was ready. The program launched in February with 10 participants from 8 different communities across the Greater Toronto Area. None of them with a university affiliation. All of them with notebooks full of problems they had been working on alone because they had not known there was a place to bring them. Sena sat in on the first session. She did not lead it. She sat near the back of the room, the same way she had once sat in an atrium on an October morning, and she watched 10 young people open their laptops and begin. And in the city beyond the glass, the lake sat gray and wide and indifferent, the way it always sat, waiting for whoever decided to pay attention.